What I'm going to talk about today is the manga writer Uchida Shungiku. And I came across Uchida Shungiku because I am at the end of a project looking at representations of pregnancy and childbirth in Japanese contemporary literature. I imagine that's something that you probably hear a lot about in Italy with your low birth rate. Japan has a similar thing. And I found that I was very curious to find out, what do Japanese women writers think about their government saying, you must have babies? And so that was the impetus for my research. As I got started, I discovered a manga writer named Uchida Shungiku who wrote a series of manga called Watashi tachi wa hanshoku shiteiru, or We Are Breeding. Hanshoku literally means to breed, which in English is maybe not the greatest word. It really means to sort of like animals forcing you to have children. And so I started looking at this manga. Right now, I was in Japan last week, and I bought her 11th volume. So she has written 11 volumes about her family. I got very interested because she really shows, Uchida is a very provocative writer. So she likes to show pictures of herself naked and pregnant. So with very big breasts and a big belly. And in the 4th volume, she actually showed a picture of her last baby coming out of her vagina. Okay, so you can imagine that this is a little outrageous. Really, you can sort of start thinking about baby pornography, and this would be the money shot. But today, I want to talk a little bit about another one of Uchida's projects, a manga that she wrote in 2007 called Sex for Girls, Josei no Tame no Sexu, which is actually a handbook for sex education. And sex education in Japan, I know because my child went to Japanese school, there's a little bit of sex education in 3rd and 4th grade, and then there's a little bit more sex education in 5th and 6th grade. But even though when you're 12 and 13 and you really just like to look at pictures of penises, it doesn't get much more advanced than that. So my first thought was that, well, Uchida Shungiku, she shows a picture of her baby coming out her vagina. What is she going to do with sex education? So I bought the book, and I found that it was something completely different. It was not outrageous. In fact, it was different and much more personal story. So what I'm going to talk about today is this sex handbook that she wrote in 2007. Maybe what I'll do before I start talking in the paper is just to give you a very brief explanation of Uchida and her family. So in Japan, as you might know, the family system is very patriarchal. There's still the ieseido, and you have a kokuseki where you have to, or a koseki where you have to register your family. Uchida decided that she didn't want to follow that system. So her first child, she got pregnant by a man who was not her husband, and then had the baby. And as you can imagine, husband number 1 didn't like that very much, so he divorced her. Or she divorced him, depending on who you listen to. Baby number 2 was fathered by somebody to whom she was not married. And then she got married again and got pregnant with baby number 3, but that was a totally different man than her husband. Then She divorced husband number 2, married husband number 3, had one more baby, and then decided that she didn't want to be married to him anymore. And so she divorced him, and then they lived together. And they lived together until February of this year. So February 2012, she, I think, gets rid of him. At least that's what, according to Wikipedia. Like I said, I've purchased volume 11, but I haven't managed to read it yet. So I'm going to rely on Wikipedia. So that's Uchida Shungiku. So this is Uchida Shungiku in person. She took in, I think it was 1990 something. She was pregnant with her 3rd child. And so she wrote a book called Anata mo Ninpu Shashi no Toro, which is you too can take pregnant pictures. And so there are pictures of her being outrageously pregnant. So here she is wearing a dress while pregnant and holding eggs. So I find that rather funny. Okay. All right. Uchida Shungiku, born in Nagasaki in 1959, is one of Japan's most prolific as well as most provocative female writers and performers. In addition to her numerous works of fiction, she has also published a series of essay collections and pursued an active career as a singer, actor, and television personality. Unlike many other writers of her generation, Uchida started her career in the more popular and youth-oriented genre of manga, an interest which has remained active even as she pursues more traditional literary efforts. Uchida's work as a graphic writer began in 1984 with the publication of her eponymously titled collection, Shungiku, a work marked by a unique combination of sexually explicit stories and gag humor. The term is Uchida's, which has gone on to become her trademark. While Shungiku and Uchida's subsequent manga enjoyed a steadily increasing popularity, however, it was not until 1994 when her career took off in earnest. Fueled by the critical and financial success, albeit with different audiences, of her novel Father Fucker, and her graphic novel Watashi tachi wa hanshoku shiteiru, We Are Breeding, which subsequently spawned a number of equally successful sequels. The surprising popularity of both works, each of them occupied the top spot on the Japanese bestseller list during 1994, earned Uchida the Bunka Publishing Company's prestigious Deux Magots Prize. More substantially, they were linked by their shared confessional autobiographical content, and in particular by the way which both wove together Uchida's own experiences as a mother and a daughter, 2 facets of her identity which have played a key role in her subsequent manga, novels, and essays. Nevertheless, Uchida's exploration of these female roles took markedly different forms in each work, due in large part to the different genres chosen for each. The novelistic approach to her childhood abuse at the hands of her stepfather in Fazafaka, referred to subsequently as FF, so I don't have to keep saying fuck all the time, for example, is a dark and rich with descriptive language, relating the plot of her protagonist, Shizuko, and the complicity of the latter's mother in horrific detail. By contrast, Uchida's stories of pregnancy and child raising in the Watashi tachi wa hanshoku shiteiru series, and this is the cover of one of them, commonly denoted by the abbreviation Watahan, are marked by a droll mixture of sex and humor, with simple line drawings imparting the feeling of lightness and capturing the everyday amusements and frustrations of being a mother. So here you have an example of Uchida with her first baby, and she is out to dinner and drops food on the baby's head from her chopsticks. Uchida's strong self-identification as a mother and a daughter provided the framework for her most autobiographical output. As Setsu Shigematsu has argued, however, Uchida's whole persona is one that both works with and against the cultural constructs of the traditional family roles perpetuated in the media, quote, relying on a perpetuation of the very modern mores and boundaries she seeks to breach. On one hand, Uchida has been a vociferous opponent in both word and deed of the traditional family system and the ideologies informing it, a stance epitomized by her refusal to combine childbearing within the institutional strictures of marriage. Only one of her 4 children, her last, was born in wedlock, while the other 3 were fathered by 3 different men, none of whom her husband at the time. Moreover, she divorced the father of her first child soon after its birth, decrying marriage as a limiting and destructive institution for women, particularly rich women. Yet Uchida's Watahan series also celebrates the nurturing values of a close-knit family and home life, one in which her children's stepfather, with whom she continues to live until this year, in a common law relationship, plays a prominent role. This strategy informs Uchida's self-presentation as a writer, artist, and performer. Above all, she's a provocateuse, offering her own life story both as an ongoing challenge to the long-standing ideal of the good wife, mother, the Ryosai Kembo, but also as an example of how motherhood and womanhood can coexist in a sexually and emotionally healthy balance. The insidious implications of traditional motherhood came to the fore in Uchida's short story collection Musuko no Kuchibiru, where the author demonstrates how persistent and entrenched the role of the mother is in Japanese society, and how being a mother tends to trump or even efface all other facets of a woman's identity. In a series of daily encounters with, among others, a taxi driver who begs her to mediate in a laundry dispute between him and his wife, and a series of young male assistants who cop the sulky attitudes of spoiled children, she finds herself expected to act like a mom rather than the competent professional she knows herself to be. As Uchida remarks about the men, they just get all clingy and needy with me as if it were the natural thing to do. Everyone seems to see me as the nurturing type. Sometimes I lose all my self-confidence and start to worry that maybe I am really that way. A much different sensibility seems to inform Uchida's Watahan series, a traditional 4-panel yonkoma manga which chronicles the ins and outs of her alter ego Gigi. Gigi appears in the first volume as the mother of a young son, constantly by her side, whom she seems to be raising alone. Indeed, she does not seem to have a long-term relationship in the first several volumes. Instead, various unnamed men, friends as well as sexual partners, flit in and out of the narrative, where Uchida humorously recounts Gigi's labors and deliveries, stories of breastfeeding, and the advice about babies and children offered by various friends and relations. Volume 3 marks the arrival of her first daughter, whose growth and development, like that of her siblings, are described in subsequent installments of the series. In the first 3 volumes, Uchida includes essays that supplement her graphic narratives, 4 of them in the series debut, as well as afterwards in the 2 subsequent paperback installments. Uchida's decision to incorporate her own reflections within the manga, while allowing her to illuminate the actions of her protagonist Gigi, also blurs the line between Uchida as author and the character's own thoughts and feelings. This technique of creating a clear yet permeable boundary between the supposedly fictional work and Uchida's autobiography, the details of which she has revealed in numerous interviews, is one with deep roots in her written oeuvre. Even in her debut novel, FF, the young first-person narrator Shizuko relates her story in a way that reveals the insights and attitudes of an older and sadly wiser woman. In both FF and the Watahan series, in other words, Uchida employs an alter ego to talk about the events in her life, a self-referencing individual who occupies the center of the narrative, with the other characters, such as Gigi's children and Watahan, used as largely dramatic props or vehicles to drive the story. Initially, this trope was used to create distance between the author and the story she wants to tell. Just as Uchida insisted that FF was a novel rather than an autobiography, the early installments of the Watahan series includes essays between each comic episode, emphasizing Uchida's own authorial voice and the marking and marking Gigi's adventures as separate and fictional. Over time, however, this wall of separation has been progressively breached. In the 6th volume of Watahan, for example, the stepfather makes an appearance, and the stories of Gigi and Uchida seem to merge. This is also the case in Uchida's series of how-to craft books, Wild Hands, where Watahan's cartoon family is overseen by Gigi, who looks suspiciously like her creator, short, slightly plump, and short-haired. Uchida even includes pictures of her family interleaved with the manga images, making their relationship all the more obvious. It is in Uchida's more recent work, however, particularly the 2007 S4G, Sex for Girls, Josei no Tame no Sei no Ohanashi, that this connection has taken its most direct and explicit form. A self-described guide to sex and reproduction for prepubescent women, Sex for Girls was written in an episodic 4-frame manga form and narrated by Gigi, with Gigi's children serving as fictional interlocutors. The theme of sex and sexuality is one with deep roots in Uchida's oeuvre. As the essays in Volume 1 of Watahan demonstrate, in particular, this is a work of fiction, and does everybody want to get married? And enough with unmarried mothers. Sexuality is seen by Uchida as a kind of absent presence within the life of Japanese mothers, a situation she confronts by decoupling marriage and childbirth and challenging the traditional notion of the mother's role in Japanese culture. While Uchida's manga protagonist Gigi loves her children, she refuses to become pigeonholed as a mother. She still maintains her career, although we are not explicitly told what she does, has a rich social life involving friends as well as lovers. Gigi thus embodies the conviction expressed by Uchida amidst the frames of the manga story. Although I might be mom to my children, I am myself to myself. Watashi wa watashi da. While I might have a child now, I can still say that I have not changed one bit. Significantly, Gigi does not fall prey to the commonly held Japanese notion that women, once they become mothers, are no longer sexual beings. On the contrary, Uchida depicts Gigi on numerous occasions engaged in an active and pleasurable sex life with a variety of partners, scenes in which a child is often present, reinforcing the compatibility of motherhood and sexual fulfillment. At first glance, Sex for Girls would seem to be a similarly transgressive, taboo-breaking challenge to social norms. The title is a takeoff on an erotic manga, Sex for Ladies, while the cover art features Gigi in fuchsia silhouette kissing a cherry against a pale blue background in which intaglio relief images of sperm swim towards her face. The irony of this titillating and sexualized wrapping is that it contains a strikingly prosaic synthesis, organized in loosely thematic fashion, of information on female sexual biology, the experience of pregnancy, and Uchida's own life history. Despite her use of the katakana loanword seksu in the title, Uchida provides no descriptions of sexual intercourse in the book. Her exhaustive discussion of the fertilization of the egg, for instance, never mentions how the sperm that are depicted as swimming gaily up the uterus into the fallopian tubes actually get there. Unlike Uchida's work in her other manga, including the Watahan series, in which she depicts her alter ego Gigi as well as her other fictional characters engaged in pleasurable and non-procreative sex, Sex for Girls firmly associates sexual intercourse with the production of children. Indeed, sex here seems to refer to biology, femaleness rather than the procreative act. This focus is apparent in Uchida's choice of topics that would seem out of place in a sex education manual, such as how to take one's basal temperature in order to chart ovulation cycles, or the true function of vaginal secretions. In this respect, Sex for Girls hews surprisingly close to the stringent regulations on primary school sex education normally offered in, as I said, in 3rd and 4th and 5th and 6th grades that were adopted by the Tokyo Board of Education in 2004. As one of the largest school districts in Japan and the home of the Japanese Diet, Tokyo has often seen its educational policies held hostage to political wrangling. The most recent changes in sex education was prompted by a 2002 survey indicating that more and more Japanese teenagers were engaging in sex, and the rate of sexually transmitted diseases and unwanted pregnancies were on the rise. Amidst claims that graphic imagery and accounts of sexual intercourse in the school curriculum had contributed to this state of affairs, school bureaucrats moved to ban any discussion of the sexual act itself and encouraged the use of clinical terms such as penis and vagina for the reproductive organs, recommending instead baby talk counterparts such as chin-chin. While this latter plan was abandoned, and chin-chin, I guess, is kind of funny here, but that's the slang word for penis. While this latter plan was abandoned, the standard health education book produced in the wake of these deliberations avoided discussions of sex per se, emphasizing instead the dry facts of human sexuality or biology. In addition, however, the elementary school education curriculum now includes local pregnant women and new mothers as guest teachers who spoke to students about their own pregnancies and about the experience of parenting a baby. And this is true. My son came home one day and I said, what did you do in school today? Oh, Mom, it was so interesting. This pregnant lady came and she told us all about how our baby was growing. And then somebody else's mom came and showed us a little baby. I said, rock on. I guess what I study is true. Kind of nice to have that confirmation. This practice is reflected, albeit wryly, in Sex for Girls, where Gigi visits her third grade son's school to talk about her pregnancy, only to be thanked by one of the mothers for teaching her so much about how babies develop. As she remarks, they kept asking, how many times did you have sex before you got pregnant? Pausing for effect, she responds simply, a lot. Uchida then draws Gigi holding up 10 fingers with a bemused smile on her face. The juxtaposition of Uchida's risque and straightforward attitudes towards sex and the need to make her book appropriate for young readers is captured in the prologue to Sex for Girls, where Gigi is trying to teach her 6- and 9-year-old daughters to wash themselves without getting soap in the delicate membranes of their vaginas. Ano ne, man no araikata da kedo, soto gawa to uchi gawa 2枚ずつ画面がわかる閉じる方になってるのね, she tells them in English. Okay, so you're going to learn a little bit of American slang here. So here's how you wash your vajayjay. That's Oprah Winfrey's favorite word, by the way. See how it has 2 folds, one inside and one outside? When her daughters seem confused, she sits down on the bath stool and shows them her own vagina by way of illustration. Uchida's overall approach to the sexual body in Sex for Girls is epitomized not only by her simultaneously intimate and clinical attitude, but by her language, in particular the term that she uses to describe the female genitals. While chin-chin is a commonly used expression for the penis, there's no corresponding word for Japanese women's sexual parts. They just refer to it as asoko. And I did some research. I went around to my the Japanese teachers at my university, and I said, so, what do you call down there? You know, your vagina. And they all sort of look, Seaman sensei, why do you want to know that? And I said, well, I'm writing a paper, as if that explains everything. I'm writing a paper, and I need to know. And I sit there and they go, yeah, yappari asoko desu ne. So Uchida's solution to this lacuna, to really make a terrible pun, is to create a neologism that merges the innocent and the vulgar, transforming the slang term omanko, which of course made everybody laugh over there, which is really equivalent to one of my least favorite words in the English language, which is cunt, into a sing-songy, childish-sounding man-man. And that's what she calls it. Yeah, this is really kind of embarrassing, right? Therefore, despite the surface similarities between Uchida's approach and the authorized sex education curriculum, her insistence on talking frankly about female sex and upon the need for young women to understand their bodies clearly and completely are the two key areas in which Sex for Girls' approach differs from that advocated by the Tokyo Board of Education. This divergence is even more apparent in the respective treatment of reproduction. In school textbooks, fertilization and pregnancy are treated as biological processes with no apparent cause, leaving students uninformed about the nature and the consequence of sex, at the same time that the teenage sexual activity and pregnancy are on the rise. Uchida's manual, however, insists on an honest, accurate, and straightforward discussion of the female body and its reproductive functions, prompted and narratively anchored by Uchida's recollections about her own childhood in 1960s and 70s Nagasaki, her own mother's conservative attitudes about sexuality, and the misinformation and half-truths about sex and her body that she was given as a girl and a young woman. Along the way, Uchida also attempts to debunk some of the stereotypes about women and women's bodies perpetuated by men. This pedagogical agenda distinguishes Sex for Girls from Uchida's early work, particularly her writings on pregnancy and motherhood. As the dust jacket, or the hon obi, of the first Watahan volume declared, "I am Gigi, a woman who is happy to breed, the one who looks forward to pregnancy and birth. You think that this would be natural, but there are a lot of people for whom it's a mystery." Describing her own experiences, Uchida's Watahan series boldly set out to reveal the secrets of pregnancy and childbirth that were normally hidden from women until they themselves become pregnant. Gleefully thumbing her nose at the calm, authoritative, and vapidly cheerful approach adopted by the standard pregnancy manuals, Uchida's alter ego discusses child rearing in a remarkably undidactic way, and her children, identified by number rather than name, serve as most often as the foils for her riffs and comic interludes. In many ways, then, Uchida's manga offer a kind of risque, episodically structured situation comedy approach to the plight of motherhood, focused upon discrete stories rather than character development. In Sex for Girls, however, Uchida has a very specific lesson that she wants to teach, one that is intimately bound up in her own life story. While this autobiographical element is by no means unique, the reflexive aspect of Uchida's early work has tended to serve as the end of a transgressive performance and titillation where Uchida's own sexual history is deployed to shock and amuse her own readers. In contrast, Uchida's past becomes a teaching resource in Sex for Girls, a collection of lessons learned. This is emphasized by the book's narrative structure in which Uchida's protagonist and alter ego, Gigi, speaks to a younger, less experienced person, usually a woman, although sometimes her oldest son or her daughters are the interlocutors, depending on the situation. This simultaneously didactic and dialogic approach is exemplified by the book's discussion of ectopic pregnancy. The autobiographical event which Uchida uses to frame her narrative here is a familiar one to her readers, described at length in the second or pink volume of the Watahan series. Uchida, Gigi, developed an ectopic pregnancy. Do you know what an ectopic pregnancy is? So, you have the egg goes down the fallopian tube, gets fertilized, and implants in the uterus. That's a normal pregnancy. And I know this because I've read lots of Uchida. If it doesn't work, the egg sometimes will implant in the fallopian tube. And as it starts to grow, it will explode. And once it explodes, then you run the risk of bleeding to death. Kind of scary. So anyhow, Uchida has this and has to have emergency surgery. So in Watahan, the emotional impact of the story revolves around the discovery of the tubal pregnancy and the extremely painful procedures needed to repair the damage, as well as Gigi's worries about having an ovary and a fallopian tube removed. In the Sex for Girls story, it serves as a pedagogical end. The emphasis not on the pain of the event or its effect on Gigi's psyche, but upon the fact that it was caused by a chlamydia, a sexually transmitted disease, that she contracted after being raped in an elevator, a fact which Gigi did not divulge in previous iterations of the story. So new information comes out. As Gigi explains to the young woman who's questioning her, the statistical likelihood of tubal pregnancies, about 10%, becomes far higher in women suffering from pelvic inflammatory diseases like chlamydia, diseases whose presence goes undetected beforehand. Rather than ending the episode with her own story of having her fallopian tube removed, as in Watahan, Gigi continues to teach her reader about the potential hazards of having a tubal pregnancy, including the potential for molar pregnancies that can implant anywhere within the woman's body, before ending with a discussion about how it's difficult to become successfully pregnant. Uchida's life story, thus, is reframed in the guise of edifying example rather than explicit expose. This goal is furthered by Uchida's recasting of the narrative context. Rather than being represented directly and graphically for the reader to see, Gigi's tale is now told by Gigi herself to an interlocutor within the representative frame. Unlike elsewhere in Sex for Girls, Gigi's discussion about ectopic pregnancies here take place with another young woman rather than her own daughters, who clearly Uchida feels would not be appropriate audience for this troubling tale. Nevertheless, the author's juxtaposition of youth and maturity, innocence and experience emphasizes here, as in elsewhere, the fundamental importance of intergenerational communication within Uchida's overall project. Sex for Girls, however, is more than just a guide for girls or conventional advice and manual. It's also a reflection upon motherhood, its responsibilities, its potentials, as well as its pitfalls. While the episodic arrangement of Sex for Girls seems at first glance to be haphazard, abruptly leading the reader from practical discussion of ovulation, fertilization, and menstruation to autobiographical expose, including the story of Uchida's childhood abuse. Uchida's storytelling is organized around a central theme, namely the critical role which mothers play in the education and upbringing of their daughters. By announcing her age, 48, at the outset of the book, Gigi highlights the gap in experience between herself and her third-grade daughter, marking their relationship in quite traditional terms as that between elder and novice, teacher and student. At the heart of this pedagogical dynamic, Uchida makes clear, should be the female body. A mother must teach her daughters how their bodies work and give them a positive body image in order for them to realize their full emotional and sexual potential as women. This lesson is driven home by stories from Uchida's own life, which demonstrate how her own lack of bodily knowledge and outdated sense of how women ought to behave damaged her emotional and sexual development. As Gigi and Uchida were growing up in Nagasaki, she received contradictory messages about women's sexuality from her mother, whose traditional and perhaps old-fashioned notions about female behavior stood in seeming contradiction to her work within the Mizushobai as a bar hostess. From the time that she was a little girl, Gigi talked about sex in an open and candid way, a habit likely learned from her mother, who used to tell me funny stories from work, she says, but whose cramped sense of social propriety led her to treat sex as something which was best left undiscussed, and who went as far to punish Gigi for showing guests her parents' bed because she was proud of the coverlet that her mother had knitted. As Gigi recalls, quote, "My mother said things like, 'I'm a good mother, but this daughter of mine is a problem child who makes lewd, ecchi comments,' criticisms that young girl found contradictory and confusing." The same kind of mixed messages was given to Uchida/Gigi concerning the appropriate contact with other people. When she was 6 or 7 years old and had rarely been hugged as a child, an older male neighbor grabbed her hands for a few seconds as he walked past her. After telling her mother she was treated to a tirade about chikan, or perverts, and berated for allowing herself to be touched by one, Gigi did not know what chikan meant and was only more mystified by the dictionary's staid and formalistic definition. Later, when Gigi was in 3rd grade, her mother spied her sprawled out in the summer heat on the veranda of her row apartment, proudly wearing a short set that her mother had made for her. "What are you doing?" she screeched. "What would happen if a pervert walked along?" Gigi's sensible reply, "But I'm wearing shorts," is rebuffed by her mother, who frets, "It doesn't matter that you're not wearing a skirt. They can still see your underpants." Such shame-ridden attitudes towards the female body only became more acute as Gigi entered puberty. When she had her first period, her mother simply showed her where the sanitary napkins were kept without any further explanation, while her teachers discussed menstruation in vague and embarrassing terms. She says, "I was told that menstrual blood was there to nourish the baby. There was no mention of eggs, sperm, or fertilization. As a result," Gigi Riley notes, "I had the unpleasant image of a blood-drinking baby in my head throughout her adolescence, despite the sex education that she subsequently received in school." It is this misleading education which leads Uchida to discover the fertilization of the egg and its implantation in the uterus in such detail elsewhere in Sex for Girls. More generally, Uchida's two brief forays into the topic of sexual intercourse are meant to demonstrate not only the essential link between sex and procreation, but the need to treat sex as a matter not for shame or silence, but as a topic to be acknowledged by mothers with their children. In the first of these episodes, the sex is depicted as the point of origin for the process of fertilization, as Gigi narrates the ejaculated sperm's progress through the vagina and eventually into contact with the egg, which I showed you earlier. In the second, Gigi reflects on a story that she read in a manga about a 20-year-old man who walked in on his parents making love. The son's mother, we're told, got up and ran away, and the next day told her son, "I didn't want to, but your father forced me, muriyari." As Gigi wondered, if she was being forced, why was she on top? Thinking about what would happen if her own 20-year-old son walked in on her partner, she concludes that his first reaction would be one of apology rather than shock, and that neither she nor her partner would be overly perturbed by the interruption. Nevertheless, she realizes that she always keeps the door to her room open, except during lovemaking, and she makes sure to warn her children accordingly. When the door is closed, it's because we're making love, dub dub, so don't open it suddenly. In reply to her younger sister's question, is making love a bad thing, Uchida's oldest daughter replies, "No, if they don't do it, they can't have a baby." As Uchida comments in the margins, those two want another brother or sister, highlighting not only the procreative function of sex, but also its proper role as a topic of honest and gentle discussion between mother and daughter. The failure to embrace this kind of honesty by her own family and the silence and shame with which the adult world treated her maturing body is associated with Uchida in a far more sinister outcome, namely her abuse at the hands of her own stepfather, quote, "the biggest pervert of all," unquote. This traumatic period, previously chronicled in Uchida's controversial novel Fatherfucker, is summarized again in Sex for Girls, this time in a way that emphasized the barely pubescent Gigi's innocence and lack of knowledge. Fondled by her stepfather, who tells her, quote, "I will snatch your virginity and make you my wife," Gigi has to look up the meaning of virginity in the dictionary. We are not shown the horrific abuse described in Uchida's novella. Instead, we are confronted with a faceless male figure and language which he dominates his stepdaughter until the beaten face of young Gigi appears in the next to last frame. Gigi's story of abuse is not meant simply to shock, but to demonstrate the critical roles of mothers educating and protecting their daughters when they are young. The story's emotional climax in Sex for Girls occurs after the actual narration. As her oldest son weeps at his mother's treatment, Gigi explains that there's a greater lesson to be learned, namely the pernicious effects of the kind of thinking that says the woman asked for it when she is raped. Her own mother said something similar to that, and made her feel like she was responsible for the abuse that she received. As a result, when Gigi was groped by a man in a local record store, she felt powerless to do anything about it. Despite her shame and anger at the attack, she realized that her mother and younger sister would hold her responsible for it. The adult Gigi, looking back at her younger self in the previous frame, concludes, "I wasn't bad, I was pitiful," before grabbing her own daughters tightly and declaring, "I won't let you feel that way." Uchida's portrayal of her mother in this affair as a black silhouette, her abusive words drift outside the traditional discursive space of the word balloon, is a clear iconographic analog to the way in which she depicts her stepfather earlier. As such, it further emphasizes in negative terms the importance of mothers for their daughters' healthy development. Without an engaged, informed, and informing mothers, girls like Uchida Gigi are rendered susceptible to men who want to take advantage of them or make them feel worthless. Such mistreatment, Uchida points out, does not have to take the extreme form that Gigi's first rape does. Instead, it can stem from something as simple as insulting comments on their physical appearance by fathers, boyfriends, and even husbands, and disinterested in their physiology beyond the basic needs for sexual gratification or the identification, explicit and implicit, of their bodily functions as polluted or inferior. As a child, Gigi was always forced to bathe after her father, who made it clear that simply being female made her dirty. This was more pronounced when she began to menstruate, at which point she was not even allowed in the bath and forced to shower outside. Gigi's first husband, whom she married at 20, offers a somewhat more comical but still striking example of these attitudes, insisting that she buy large tampons due to his own inflated sense of his penis size, and ignorantly asking why she takes her basal temperature orally instead of vaginally. Showing a tampon to her young interlocutor, she explains that women who use them used to be considered hasba. Recognizing the girl's ignorance of the term, Gigi bluntly defines it for her as slut. She warns the young woman to find a husband who will be nice to her when she has her period. In a similarly and less dire message is conveyed by the reaction of Gigi's young son when he sees his mother's labia and mistakenly assumes that she's defecating on the bath stool. While this episode is unsettling since it directly follows the opening vignette in which Gigi educates her daughters about their genitals in a gentle and positive way, it is allowed to pass without explicit commentary. Nevertheless, her response upon hearing her son's comment, "Am I really that dark?" suggests that not only the differences between mother and daughter and mother and son interactions, but the potentially disruptive effect which the male gaze and male words can have on women's self-esteem and self-image. This contrasts sharply with the far more positive tone of the preceding scene set in the bath, where her older daughter is struck by the difference in color between her own genitalia and those of her mother. Rather than respond with self-criticism as she does with her son, Gigi patiently explains why her body looks the way it does. Quote, "When the mucous membranes get stronger, they get darker. So when you become an adult, they turn black." Reassuring her daughters that they are different from their mom and that this difference is okay, Gigi hugs them tight. This parental intimacy and Gigi's positive reaction to her daughter's questions, as she notes, "I am glad I was able to talk about it so well," drive home Uchida's larger point that mothers must give their daughters positive messages about their body in a direct and understanding way. When bathing with their children, mothers should be sure to clean the latter's genitals in a matter-of-fact fashion using plain language instead of euphemisms in order to make them comfortable and confident about their own sexual organs. As Uchida remarks in an aside, when you take a negative attitude about washing your children's genitals, do it grudgingly as if the genitals were something dirty, you leave your child with a negative feeling about sex. Instead, she suggests the parent should say, "Let's make your important parts clean," reinforcing her points by suggesting that mothers ought to be at least as serious as they are when they're telling their children to be gentle with a household pet. Failing to do so, Uchida argues, leads into an unpleasant territory. Mothers, for example, who still bathe their fourth-grade son and tells him, "Your penis is so nice, Mama wants one too." As the narrator bluntly points out, people who don't see the problem here should simply imagine a father washing his third or fourth grade daughter's genitals. In all of these respects, Uchida's Sex for Girls stretches the boundaries of what sexual education manuals should be or do. As we've seen here, very little of it would be much help to a girl who wanted to know about the nuts and bolts of sexual intercourse and birth control. Is it possible, of course, that this fact simply stems from an attempt to follow the government's content guidelines imposed on the author by her editor and publisher? I would argue, however, that the peculiar form and content of Sex for Girls is motivated by Uchida's sense of a crisis of sexual self-image among Japanese girls and women in the 21st century. Much of Gigi's concerns about how women are treated is rooted in and expressed in terms of Uchida's own upbringing and experiences as a Japanese woman. These experiences, however, are now understood as object lessons, both positive and negative, for Uchida's own offspring, whom she wishes to spare abuse and degradation. Not only the explicit and personal mistreatment she's endured, but the relentless objectification and diminution of women's sexuality that pervades Japanese society in general and makes life histories like her own possible. reflecting upon the ubiquitous representation of women in TV ads as lost lambs, bolyo, with high-pitched voices. Uchida concludes that this only exacerbates the cultural presence upon women to, quote, act helpless in order to be chosen by men and defined by male lust, unquote. She looks at her daughters watching her with hopeful, wide eyes and realizes that there are many struggles facing her, one that they are too young to understand and too complicated for her to explain in appropriately simple terms. This awareness also indicates the degree to which Sex for Girls, although it addresses the same issues as her earlier works, represents a significant change for Uchida. As before, she still writes in a uniquely personal and even confessional style, freely sharing her loves, her fears, her enthusiasms, and her pet peeves. Yet, after a career spent defining herself as a transgressive woman, fearlessly challenging the social taboos around sex and violence, and redefining the traditional roles of daughter, mother, and wife, Uchida Shungiku here begins to focus her energies and talents upon something beyond, if still close to herself, her daughters. In a large part of facing the separation between herself and her alter ego, Gigi, born Shizuko, Uchida uses her own past as a daughter, not as a subject in itself, but as a way to reflect upon what it means for herself to be a mother. Talking about the past, therefore, becomes more than an act of self-definition and promotion. It is a labor of love, an attempt to explain what was in order to teach your daughters what they should and can become. For this reason, Sex for Girls should be read as sex education, but in a fuller and more complex sense, combining biology and biography to teach what it might mean to positively understand oneself as a young woman, a woman, that is, who by knowing her body knows her worth, and by knowing her worth can participate freely and confidently in the world around her. Thank you.